Hello everyone, my name is Claire Scobie and it's a great pleasure to be here today as part of the Alliance of Independent Authors Self-Publishing Advice Conference 2018. I'm going to be speaking on how to publish a book with a family member. Specifically, I wrote a book with my mum, Patricia Scobie, and this is part of the self-publishing for pleasure and profit theme. So I thought I'd break it down into 5 sections, 5 steps, which I hope will be easy for you to follow, and you'll gain lots of tips and tricks on how to write your own book with a family member, perhaps your mum, perhaps an aunt, perhaps a sibling. So the steps are as follows. First of all, your motivation. Secondly, getting started. Thirdly, the writing process. Fourthly, revision and finishing. And fifthly, the indie publishing process. I'm going to be sharing my screen occasionally, and I've put those 5 steps into a document, so I will show you and remind you periodically through the presentation. So why motivation to start? I've mentored writers over the years. I've also taught hundreds and hundreds of writers at different writing courses over the years. And I think motivation is one of those things that people underestimate, because motivation is really important. Because if you know why you're writing a book, why you're embarking on a really big project like this that may take years, it can really help you, particularly during the tough times. And I always think there are 3 different phases when writing. You've got the beginning phase, which is when everything's possible, you feel very excited. It's that spring energy. Then you've got the middle phase of writing, when you're in the grind, when you can get lost in the woods. And during those times, you really need to keep reminding yourself why it is you actually embarked on this big project. What was your motivation? And then you've got the finishing phase, which is when you're climbing to the top of the mountain, and every time you think you're there, there's yet another peak to climb. And again, reminding yourself why you're doing it is really important during that phase. So before you even start on your project, or even if you're writing or co-writing a book with a family member, just stop to think about and have a conversation with your co-writer about why it is you're doing it. What do you want to get out of it? Some people want to write something for their children as a legacy piece. Some people do want to write something that's going to make them money. Other people are doing it because they want to explore a subject, or maybe you're doing it with an elderly parent in order to capture memories about that person while those memories are still fresh. So come back to your motivation and be clear on it when you start. So why did my mum and I decide to write our book? Our book is called A Baboon in the Bedroom. And it's a travel memoir about my parents' journeys across Africa. In 1990, my parents, Tony and Patricia Scobie, set off in a Land Rover called Stan from London and drove to Cape Town. It was the eve of the Gulf War, and ahead of them lay the entire African continent. But that actually isn't why Mum and I decided to write the book. In 2012, my dad wasn't well, and at that time, as a way to keep him looking forward and keep him staying positive, I thought it would be a good idea if he and I started to write his journals, started to write his memoirs. Sadly, he passed away in July 2012. So Mum and I decided to work on the book together after that. I'm English, but I live in Sydney, and my mum lives near Oxford in the UK. So in a way, it was also a way for me to stay connected to her when I came back to Australia. And it helped us both, particularly her, through the grieving process. So there were many different reasons why we decided to write the book. And at the beginning, I didn't know whether it would eventually be published. I just knew that it would be a lovely project for us to work on together, and I would learn more about her and about my parents and their amazing adventures. And that was one of the benefits that came out of working on the book with her, because I learned about my parents in quite a different way through her eyes. And during the months and those initial years after my dad passed away, it was a really beautiful thing to do together. Because I'm in Australia and she's in the UK, we actually did a lot of our work via Skype. So my evenings or her mornings would be spent going through the book and talking about the process. And it certainly brought us closer. So that was one of the main motivations for us writing the book, although I'm not sure we knew it at the beginning stage. So getting started, how do you begin? I think at the beginning you want to do a mind map exercise or a scoping exercise to work out what it is you're actually writing. I can imagine many of you might be writing a family memoir of some sort, or maybe you're doing a memoir which involves genealogy research, or it could be a travel memoir. So I think at the beginning you really want to work out what is going to be in your story. And that can take some time. Certainly we put together a big spreadsheet of all the journeys that my parents had done in Stanley, the Land Rover. And we filled that spreadsheet, and at the beginning, that fantastic beginning energy when anything seems possible, we thought we would write a whole series of books about my parents' travels. And in fact, it's taken us 4 years to just write one of them, which was the first big journey from London to Cape Town. But at least it gave us a sense of the landscape and what areas we wanted to focus on. And I think at the beginning, it's a good idea to cast your net wide and think about all the areas you could write about, and then focus in on one or two. So how do you focus in? Whenever I teach memoir or travel memoir, I like to talk about the thread of the story. This is also known as the through line or the spine of the story. I like to ask people to imagine opening their wardrobe. You open your wardrobe and there's a metal bar, and on that metal bar are all these hangers, and your clothes hang on these hangers. But that metal bar is like the spine or thread, and it literally, like a thread, pulls you through the narrative. The clearer you are on your thread at the beginning of writing a narrative non-fiction book, like a memoir, the easier it is to write. Because if you know what the thread of your story is, you start to know what to bring to the foreground and what to leave in the background. And people often ask me, well, I don't know what my thread is. Should I start writing anyway? The answer is yes. However, I think you need to keep coming back and asking yourself, what is the strongest storyline here? And an easy way to do that, or an easier way, is to turn it into a question. So in fiction, there's something called the MDQ, or the major dramatic question. And that is the question that your protagonist essentially starts with this question. By the end of the story, that question has been answered. So very simply in fiction, this could be, does the boy get the girl? That's a romantic book or romantic movie. By the end of the book or the story, we know whether the boy gets the girl. So you can also do this with narrative non-fiction or memoir. So in the case of my parents' journeys, it did take quite a bit of time before we figured out what our major dramatic question was. And it really came down to, did my parents succeed in driving from London to Cape Town in their Land Rover called Stan? And did they flourish in their relationship? And what was the impact of that journey on them as a couple? So as you can see, that's sort of 3 parts to that major dramatic question. and you can simplify it for sure. So when you're beginning, think about what the through line is, or what the major dramatic question is, and it may not come immediately, but if you keep coming back to it, it will help you figure out what needs to go into the story and actually what doesn't need to go into the story. I think the other really useful thing to do at the beginning is literally just write out your chapter headings, particularly for narrative nonfiction or nonfiction in general. It's quite easy to plan out what your chapter headings are going to be ahead of time. And then again, you've got a bit of a roadmap. Now, let's talk a little bit about how you work with a family member. So I think one person has to be in the driving seat, as it were. And that's mainly because if one person kind of directs the project, it actually is easier. So because I'm a professional writer and writing is what I do, and my mum isn't a writer, although she has kept journals all her life, it was obvious that it was going to be me who was going to be sort of driving the project. I think it's easier that way. Of course, you can do everything together. And I do know of writers who've co-authored books together where one person has written one chapter and the other person has written the other chapter. So you do alternate chapters. That's one way to do it. Another way to do it is to have one main voice, and then the other person writes sections, but ultimately it all is told through one singular voice. Again, those are the sorts of questions you want to have at the beginning. And sure, it might evolve as you go, but I think the clearer you are at the beginning about that sort of thing, the easier during the actual process of writing. And also at the beginning, you want to think about how you're going to divide the work up. Is one person going to do more of the research and the other person the writing? Are you going to try and keep it half-half, etc., that sort of thing? And it might simply be, say, if you're working with an elderly family member and you're collecting his or her memories, then it's likely to be one person really just driving the story, doing all the research process and then writing it. And the other person is the person who's being interviewed. If you're doing it with a family member who isn't a writer, I think it's also really important to make sure they feel involved. So with my mum, she did a lot of the smaller bits of research that we needed for the story. So about different countries in Africa, the politics, during the time that she and my dad, Tony, travelled through Africa. So she did a lot of that side of things. She also collected the photos because photos were part of the final book. And she spoke to other members of the family about him, other friends who were part of some of the trips that they made. And so she did different aspects to the writing than I did. However, I always made sure that anything I changed or anything I wrote, she always checked and she was happy with. And so many of the sections we did together, but some sections I just wrote myself, but always with her guidance or her checking. So that's the first part. So you've got motivation and then getting started. And I thought now it might be nice if you'd like to see a photo of my mum so you can identify with her. So I'm just going to share my screen a minute and show you a picture of her and then a picture of us. Because I think it's always nice to actually see the person. And I might just have to come back to that in a minute. Here we go. Hopefully you can see this. This is a picture of my mum in a lovely, colourful outfit. And so her name's Patricia, but actually in the book, she's known as Wink. Wink's her nickname, so I'll probably refer to her as Wink. Okay, so you've got started, you've got a bit of a rhythm going. What happens next? The actual writing begins. So in the case of my mum, we were really lucky because she, as I mentioned, she's written journals all her life. And during their travels in Africa, she wrote every evening. And so we had those journals essentially as a first draft. And for any of you who are writing about your ancestors and you've got some letters perhaps, or you've been researching genealogy, those are often going to be your first draft of whatever it is you're writing. Now, my mum's writing is notoriously difficult to read, and I'm just going to show you what it actually looks like. There you go. I hope you can see that. As you can see, it's a particular style, and in the end, the process that we went through, and this did take time, but in the end, it really paid off. Was I had photocopies of all the journals, and when I went back to Australia via Skype, she actually read the journals out to me and I transcribed them on the screen. As she was talking, I was typing. So yes, that did take time. However, 3 really lovely things came out of it. First of all, it was a process of me understanding her journey in her words. Secondly, it gave me insight into how she thought and how she writes and how she thinks, which was really useful in the writing process. And lastly, it actually brought us closer, I think. And often when we were doing this process, we would be in fits of laughter. It was very funny. And even though I was always conscious of the fact that she was talking about my dad, and my dad had recently passed away, and I would often check in with her that she was fine to talk about that. We really had a lot of fun doing it. So once we had transcribed the sections of the journal that we knew would be relevant, and we knew that because we were clear on what our thread was, or our major dramatic question. So some bits of the journal we knew we wouldn't need, so there was no point in transcribing them. So again, this gets back to the clearer you are on what the thread is, the easier it is to pull together the entire non-fiction book. Once we'd got a first draft together, we then started working out how to turn it into a narrative. And one of the big issues when you're writing memoir or travel memoir is that there's a lot of narration. If you think about how you write a journal, you simply just write what happened. You don't write it as scenes. And there's a tendency to have writing which sounds a bit like this. And then I woke up, and then we set off, and then we drove, and then. Now, that's not very interesting for a reader. So at that point, I think it's really helpful to think about what are the key moments in your story? What are the key turning points in your narrative? Is there an obvious climax? And for this, you can use very usefully something like the 3-act structure, the dramatic structure, where you have an obvious peaks and troughs in the narrative. And you can look at someone like Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. He talks a lot about this archetypal story that has been used again and again in fiction, but actually works quite well in narrative, non-fiction, and memoir. And I think the most important thing to remember at this point is, what's your thread? What's going to keep the reader reading? So inevitably, it means that sections of the story that my mum really enjoyed actually had to go because they were too repetitive. And that was probably one of the hardest things, I think, for her to accept. And I totally understand that, because my first travel memoir, called Last Seen in Lhasa, I was exactly the same. When my editor came back to me and said that I had to cut out sections of my journey, I remember thinking, no, I've got to have everything in there. The reader's got to know everything. And of course, the reader doesn't have to know everything. The most important thing is to keep the reader turning the pages. If you can do that, then you're going to have a happy reader. So when you take the narrative from first draft to second draft and then into third draft, you're really looking at tightening, at shortening, and most importantly, you're thinking about where the big scenes are, where are the big moments that you need to show in a moment-by-moment experience for your reader. And this is essentially where you're moving between narration, which is telling, into showing, which are the scenes. And I'm sure all of you are very familiar with show, not tell. However, if you're working with a family member who isn't so familiar with that, again, that's a bit of a learning curve. And so working with my mum, I needed to keep reminding her about, okay, what did this moment look like? What did it feel like? What was going through your mind at this point? Were your hands clammy? Were you nervous? Now, my mum and dad, pretty stoic. They've travelled across Africa, they've had guns waved in their faces, and my mum just kind of kept going with a smile. And when I'd say to her, were you nervous? She'd laugh and say, well, I was a bit nervous, but I don't really, talk about that stuff. And I'd say, but for a reader to experience that you were a bit nervous, that's important. They need to kind of feel that, what was going on for you. Even if it's only once in the story, and it's a few more times than just once. So I think if you're working with a family member who's not used to talking about their feelings, perhaps, or not used to describing them in a way that you need to on the page, you'll probably find you need to try different methods of getting them to think about it like that. And for me, it was always coming back to, so what did that feel like for you? Remember, we've got to show the reader moment by moment what it was like as you approached the first big bog hole in, as it was, Zaire. And this bog hole was the length of 3 double-decker buses end to end, and they had to drive their Land Rover through it, and they had no idea whether they'd get to the other end. So at this point, in a way, if you're driving the project, you're probably likely to be a bit of a coach to your family member, unless they are also writers themselves. So I think you just want to remember that. The other thing that really helped for us was thinking about dialogue. So again, even though the journals provided an excellent first draft of the story, they're all written in narration. They didn't have dialogue in them. So we needed to recreate that dialogue. So I would always be asking my mum, what did you say at that point? What did my dad say? Can you remember how he might have acted? Of course, I know his gestures, but she and him had their own gestures that they would do together. So really, you're also trying to recreate that relationship in a way that's very vivid and lifelike on the page. So we did this process via Skype, because I'm in Australia and she's in the UK. And then we also had bursts of time when I was over in the UK and she came over to Australia about 2 years into the project, and where we actually sat next to each other and worked through sections. Now, I think if we had been living next door to each other, we probably would have finished the book in less time. But there you go. This is the reality for us. So I think if you do live close to a family member, then it's really helpful if you just try and keep up the momentum. And inevitably, there's going to be peaks and troughs where life gets in the way, or perhaps you're working on other projects. But the more you can keep going with it once a week, twice a week, it just keeps up that momentum. And I think that really helped us. At this point, when you're in the process, so this is the middle stage of writing, it can be really helpful to get help from other family members. So once we'd done a couple of drafts and we felt that it was actually going somewhere as a book, I gave it to my sisters. I've got 2 older sisters, Jane and Sarah, and I gave it to their husbands, and they read the manuscript for us, and they helped give advice on which bits they thought worked or which bits we just didn't sound right. They were particularly helpful with the dialogue, where they felt that the dialogue sounded a bit fake, or the dialogue just didn't have that same flow. They were really helpful with that sort of thing. And also in making suggestions about, let's have a bit more of this, a bit more drama here, or we want to know what they were actually feeling, you know, when the police shined a torch in their eyes, that sort of thing. So you definitely want to involve other family members, because they are then part of the project. And I think that's important, particularly when it gets to the point when you're not sure if you can ever finish it. And I'm sure if any of you have written a book before, you've got to that point before. The other helpful strategy at this point is to get somebody who's not connected to the book to read it as well. I actually got a friend who's a writer and a former editor, a newspaper editor, to read it. And he made some really helpful suggestions. He suggested that we start the book in a more dramatic moment than where we had started it. We'd started it as they were leaving Marseille on the boat to Algiers in Africa. And he suggested, why don't we actually start it when they were in the Sahara, which totally makes sense. You want to start in media res, or in the middle of the dramatic action. And he also made some other really good suggestions, and he said that the last third of the book really lost its way, and if we were serious about trying to get this published, then we really needed to work on that. And for me, that was a bit of a wake-up call, because by that point we'd been working on it for quite a while. I really felt that it was a great story, and I really felt people would enjoy reading about this story. But I knew then that in order to get it to a level that I felt happy with, and to a professional level, it would require a considerable amount more work. And I'll be honest with you, at this point, I had several projects on the go. I was starting a new business. I was writing my second novel. And this project with my mum, even though I was totally enjoying it and loving it, I kept finding it kept slipping to the bottom of the list. And I felt guilty about this. And that's the other thing you need to remember if you're working with a family member. It's not just going to be that professional contract that you have with other people. There's always going to be the emotions involved. And I knew that Mum was feeling a bit frustrated because we weren't getting on to it as quickly as she'd hoped, and I kept saying I was going to do things on it and then not doing things, and then I felt worse. So one day I decided, okay, I just need to treat it like another job. And at this point, probably getting a contract or coming up with a simple contract with the family member would be a really good idea. And I know that the wonderful Joanna Penn has talked about this, because she's written a series of romance novels with her mum. And I haven't got a contract with my mum for this book, but it is something we've talked about, and I am going to do one with her, even though the book's finished. So at this point, I would encourage you all to just think about that side of things as well, just because then it's down in writing, whatever you decide you're going to do, however you're going to work it. But for me at that point, I said to her, look, I need to treat it as a job, and I'm wondering if you can pay me to do some hours on it, just as my other clients, my mentor clients, pay me. And that was really hard for me to ask her. Now, in the end, she never actually paid me, because I didn't actually want the money. I just wanted to trick myself almost, to have that carrot and stick approach in order to keep working on it. And so I kept telling her that I was making a note of all the hours that I was spending on it. And in the end, she didn't actually pay me any money. She paid me in kind. And I think that was a really good solution, because it just meant that it always stayed at the top of my list. So if you're finding that, I think you just need to find creative ways to work around it, to know that you've got to keep writing to get to the end. So during a middle phase of writing, it can be hard to maintain that momentum. So I think that carrot and stick approach is really helpful. And at the end of this presentation, I'm going to share a few photographs of my mum and I at different phases in the writing process. So by this time we were into draft 3. It was, we'd had some input from other people, and remember that if you do have input from other people, it is really helpful, and you do need to take the time for that to happen. So if you are going to get other family members to read your memoir or whatever you're working on, make sure you include how long that's going to take you. You need to give people a month normally in order to read a manuscript. So there's quite a few other things you want to be thinking about at this stage. You're into, say, draft 3, perhaps into draft 4, and now you're starting to think about the title and the cover and editing and that sort of thing. So you do feel like you're getting towards the end. I think at this point, it's also really helpful to think about somebody who you can ask who's an expert in the area. So for us, we wanted someone who's a real expert in Africa. And we were very lucky to get Mark Doyle, who's the former BBC correspondent for Africa, to read the manuscript and to give us some really expert advice on and tweak things where we hadn't got it quite right. And again, I'd really encourage you, if you're going to get someone involved, whether it's a historian or whatever you need in order to make sure the book is accurate, get them involved early. Because we probably got Mark involved a bit too close to the end when we thought we'd finished. And in fact, he went through and gave us the most rigorous edit that I've ever had on anything I've ever written. And at that point, I really thought I was going to lose my mind, because I thought we'd nearly finished and yet we hadn't quite got to the top of the mountain. And I'm just going to find a photograph of that so you can see us in a slightly unguarded moment. So at this point, you want to be thinking about how you can really, here we go, this is us. My mum had come to Australia to come on holiday for about 3 weeks over Christmas, and I'd rented a cottage for us to finish the book, and here we were finishing the last edits from our expert reader Mark Doyle, and as you can see, I'd slightly lost it by that point. But it is important to get that sort of advice, because if you do get that sort of advice from someone, it just makes the whole book that much stronger. And I'm just going to show you another picture of us as we were going through the pages, page by page. And at this point, we really were into the final edits, and both of us looking slightly punch drunk there, even though we were just drinking cups of tea. So I think it's important to keep the momentum at this point. And I'm always saying to writers, you do almost have to trick yourself to keep going to the end, whether it's cake, whether it's you book yourself a little holiday. The other thing that can really help is booking 2 or 3 nights away in a B&B somewhere. We spent a few weekends at my sister's house in Norfolk. And I just think going away and immersing yourself in the project is often really effective, because you actually get right into the storyline. And we certainly got a lot of work done by doing that. And we did that sort of quite a few times, every few months, whenever we could, and I was over in the UK. So at this point, we're getting to the stage of finishing it. We're going through those drafts. Remember, it's going to take a bit longer than you think. And we're starting to get covers drawn up. So we used a cover designer in the UK called Bernie Stevens, who did some covers for us, and I'll show you them in a minute. And at this point, also, I hired a professional copy editor to go through it, somebody who had actually worked on my first book, Last Seen in Lhasa. So it was a copy editor I knew. And I think it is important to get a copy editor that you feel comfortable with. And you might need to interview 2 or 3 to find someone that really works for you, because everybody's got a particular style. And similarly, we also got a proofreader who I'd worked with previously, and she was fantastic, both English, because the book's very much an English voice. So even though I'm in Australia, I wanted to use English editors. It's the nuances that are really important here when you come down to the editing process. So we had it professionally copy edited. We paid for that process. Same with the proofreading process. And then we were thinking about design and how to do the self-publishing. So I hadn't self-published before because my books have been traditionally published. So rather than do it ourselves, which is obviously one option, I decided to go with a publishing company in Sydney called Longville Publishing, and they did all the typesetting for us. And I thought that was a really good move, because it meant that we didn't have to worry about all of those decisions. And to be honest, I felt like at this point it was just this massive project that we just needed to get to the end. And I was really happy to hand over that sort of process to somebody else. But obviously you do need a budget for that. If you don't want to do that, there are many options. You can do things like vellum. You can that can be a way to typeset your pages or create space. So lots of different options there. But we decided to go with a company to do that. And in order to get some feedback and to get some interest in the book, and this is it, we're now into the final stage, we're now into the finishing and getting published stage. I think it's a great idea to harness support through your social media networks. So we put our different cover designs on my author Facebook page, and I also shared it among friends, and we got loads of people interested that way. I think it was a really good way to do pre-publicity. We also crowdsourced the title of the book, A Baboon in the Bedroom, and the full title is Across Africa in a Land Rover called Stan. So again, it was partly to get people involved, but it was also to get a wider team together. And for my mum, this was really exciting, because even though she's actually not on Facebook, so I was doing all of this, it was just exciting for her to feel like we were getting to the end and there was all this interest in the book. So in the end, we decided to get it printed in the UK, and we used a lovely printer that's been around since the 1890s in Wales called Goma. And we decided to do that because actually it was cheaper to get the book traditionally printed, like not traditionally printed, but as a hard, as a paperback version in the UK. It was cheaper to do that than in Australia. And they did a beautiful job, and they bound it, and they included the photos. And even that in itself was quite a big project to manage. And luckily, our proofreader, a wonderful woman called Sarah Abel, sort of shepherded it through that process of the printing process to make sure that everything was as it should be. So at this point, you want to remind yourself that, writing a book and co-authoring a book with a family member is one part of the puzzle, I guess. But actually, to get it to completion, particularly if you're going to do a print version, not just an ebook version, you do need to, you are likely to enlist other people's help. And if you're good at project managing, then that's great. But if you're not, then it certainly is helpful to bring in someone who knows about this sort of stuff. So I'm going to wrap up soon, but I wanted to just talk about a few of the pitfalls and potholes, and then the benefits that can come out of this sort of process. So I think a couple of pitfalls is just remember when you're working with it's not really a pitfall, but it's something to be aware of. When you're working with a family member, you are likely to have very different working styles. I tend to be quite fast, I write all the time. And so for my mum, sometimes it was too much. There was this kind of disconnect really between how I would go about things and how she liked to go about things. And I think you just need to be aware of that and moderate your own pace, perhaps, if it doesn't suit the family member who you're working with. The second thing is just to keep communicating. Even if things aren't going well, especially if things aren't going well, it's just important to talk about things as they come up rather than leave things to fester. We never did that, but I could see that it is the sort of thing that could trip you up. I think thirdly, it is about not just making it about you and that family member, if you can, getting other people involved, because particularly towards the end, you need that support from other people, because that's what will help you get over the line. I'm a great believer that the people who actually finish books are those who have a community behind them. With many of the authors that I've worked with, that's often been the difference between failure and success. The ones who don't have that support are the ones often who don't actually finish. So I now just want to talk about the wonderful things that have come out of this book. And I think you must never underestimate the impact that a book can have to someone's life. Because a book is like a platform, a book is a doorway, a book gives incredible sense of pride to people. And whether that book is actually published independently, or whether you just do a 50 print run for your family, it does really give a real uplift to people. So since the book was published, and I will share at the end some photographs of my mum during her book launch. We had a lovely book launch at home. She's gone on to speak at a literary festival in Tame. And she's sold books like that. She's done various talks, and that's something that we're working on together to expand. The book's now on Amazon, so even though it isn't selling hugely, it is getting out there, and every so often she gets emails from readers who really enjoy it. And probably that side of the process I need to do more on. I'll be completely frank about that. But it's really given her a new sense of self, I think. She's got a card with her name and the book on it and the title author. She's sometimes, when she's in the village or when she's going about her business, doing the shopping, she'll meet someone who's read the book, and I can just see how much joy that gives her. And then the other measure of success, and I think at the end you really want to ask yourself, what is the measure of success here? Is it about trying to sell 500 copies? And really for her biggest measure of success is sharing this story with the family, with her grandchildren, and them learning new things about her and my dad. And also really celebrating my dad's life. And he was an extraordinary man. So I think from all of those points of view that the book's really been fulfilling. So that's very much the pleasure side. From the profit side, we haven't made our return yet. And the publicity and that side of things, I think, is another whole step of really making the most of it. We certainly use Facebook a lot. I drive a lot of that. We also put together a reader magnet, which is a photo essay of pictures from the Serengeti in Tanzania that we offer to readers, and we share with readers to say thank you to anybody who's posted a review on Amazon. But the publicity side, I admit, I've sort of been distracted again by finishing this other project now, and it's something I'm going to get back to. So I really hope that this has been useful. It took us 4 years. I think it could have taken us less. However, I think like anything, it had its times when it really did more than, it was more than just a creative project. It was about connection, it was about understanding, and I just feel so much closer to her, and I feel this incredible sense of knowing more about my parents and their marriage and their love. And I think that the whole book is infused with that. So whatever book you're going to be working on with your family member, really enjoy the process and be prepared for the wild ride. It probably will be a bit of a ride. And I hope you enjoy the process and you get as much satisfaction out of it as my mum, Patricia Scobie, and I have. Thank you so much. Any questions, please email me. All my details will be with the presentation, or please share anything about the book on social media. And I'm now going to show you, of course, the final version, a baboon in the bedroom, and I'll also share with you some of the different covers we went through and that sort of thing, so you kind of can get a sense of the process. Thank you so much.